Hey nerdy knitters! In this video we're going to look at some tips for working with variegated yarn. Yarns like this, where you've got long and short lengths of different colors all in one skein, and you're not really quite sure how it's going to knit up. I have some tips for you today on how to work with this kind of yarn. We'll look at what affects color repeats, how to choose projects so you don't get that weird color pooling effect, and one highly recommended book if you like to use variegated yarns but you're never sure how to use them. I have one book recommendation that has a fabulous section on using variegated yarns. Now before we get to our 6 tips, let's talk about the things that affect the color changes in your pattern. First off is the length of the repeats of the color in the specific yarn. I have 2 examples here. This one is a worsted weight cotton, the kind that you might use to make some dishcloths. And when you look at the repeats, you can see each color, that's quite a long color change. If we were to use a ruler to measure this, that's more than 12 inches for that one color. And then the next color, this one's a little shorter, probably half that length. And then we get another color. So we have some longer color changes in this one mixed with some shorter. This other variegated yarn I have here is a sock yarn, Heart and Soul. And if you look at the color changes here, they are very short. There's the first one, there's the second one. It changes quite often. So you can see from just those 2 examples, the first thing that will affect your pattern is the length of the variegation in the yarn itself, the length of each color. Now, what do these different lengths of color changes mean for an actual pattern? Well, first off, if it's a really short color change, you're going to get lots of variation in your pattern and it'll be really mixed up and different in every row. But when you have longer color changes, like the first example we looked at, that's where you will get stripes or variegated color pooling. The longer the length, the more likely you'll end up with the weird pooling you might expect in a variegated yarn. The shorter the length, the less likely to have the color pooling. The other major part of how these colors will work together is the width or the circumference of your project. If you're knitting a sock and if you're knitting a sweater, the width and the circumference are 2 very different things, and that affects how that variegated yarn will look. I did a quick search on Ravelry for one specific color of Malabrigo yarn to show you as an example. Now look at these examples here. These are all using the same colorway of the same yarn. And you can see this pair of socks and this bralette. The colors are pooling in different ways. We almost have some stripes here in this one. And this one you can see the colors are pooling. And that one has more color pooling. That looks like a shawl. And it looks like stripes in this sock pattern. So as you can see, just from that quick example, the width or the circumference of your project will affect how the colors work together. Now that we understand a little bit about how variegated yarn works and what your project will do with that yarn, here are 6 tips for using variegated yarn. First of all, you could look for a pattern that includes a second solid contrasting color to help break up the color pooling. I have an example here that shows that Heart and Soul yarn. When I knit it up, just in a basic rib pattern, you can see all of those color changes, all the variegated colors and how they look. It does have sort of a short stripy effect. And this is what happens when I include it in a second color. I alternate it every 2 rows with black. And you can see the difference right there, how that really changes the look of that yarn. I did a mosaic pattern on the front. I'll link this pattern down below so you can find it. And you can see right there, the same variegated yarn, adding a second color to it really changes the way those colors work together. There are lots of ways to add a second contrasting color. You can use simple stripes like that sock. We looked at the back side of that sock. Another way to include a second color is with 2-color brioche, like this shawl right here. There's lots of colors going on in this shawl, but it looks like a variegated yarn there in the middle, and adding a second color helps break up the variegation. My next tip is to choose a slip stitch or traveling cable pattern. By slipping stitches, you're elongating them, and when you're making traveling cables, you're making them move across the fabric. in different ways, and that can also change the way those colors play together. Like this example right here, this cowl pattern uses a slip simple cross pattern, and it changes the colors just slightly. This is a Malabrigo yarn, and you can see how that slip stitch crossing across there changes the look of the pattern. Now this one isn't worked in a variegated yarn, but I think you can understand here how these stitches are traveling across the work. That will affect how your variegated yarn looks as well. Now for short color changing yarns like our Heart and Soul, I like to look for small lace or eyelet or textured designs. That can really help break up the colors too to make them even more interesting, like this example here. If you just look at the difference between the garter section and the lace section, you can see how the colors are changing even by changing your stitch pattern. Another tip is to change directions, things like mitered squares and short rows and even chevron shaping. It can change the effect of the colors, like this example. This shawl uses short rows, and you can see how that might affect some color changes. If you have a tip for using variegated yarns, be sure to leave us a comment and tell us about it down below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you like to get nerdy with your knitting. Now, if you don't want to include a second color or work a textured pattern and you're really set on using stockinette with your variegated yarn, the first thing you should do is swatch to see how it will look. And if you find that you don't like how one skein works up by itself, use 2 skeins and alternate them every row or 2, and that will help break up those colors as well. And if you only have 1 skein, you could wind it into 2 separate balls and still do the same thing. And one other tip is to combine 2 different variegated yarns. Swatch it out and see how they work together. My very last tip, if you really love color work and color knitting, I have one book recommendation for you. This book right here. The Essential Guide to Color Knitting Techniques by Margaret Radcliffe. She covers all of the major color work techniques, and she has a wonderful section on using variegated yarn in here. One of her tips for adding some texture with a variegated yarn is to choose one color of the yarn, and whenever that color shows up on your needles, to purl those stitches instead. That way you get some random texture added to the pattern, and it can break up the colors a little more. She has lots of other great tips like that in this book. So if you like to use variegated yarn, I highly recommend that you add this resource to your home library. Now be sure to leave a comment if you have a tip on variegated yarn, and be sure to subscribe if you like to get nerdy with your knitting.